Hello and welcome back to our second episode of Royal Service, my 12 years as valet to Prince Charles. A lot of you really loved the first episode, as did I, so I can't wait to get stuck into it again. So the title of Chapter 3 is Going to Work at Buckingham Palace. I was 18 years old in 1966 when I first went to work at Buckingham Palace. Prince Charles was also 18 and away at school at Gordonstoun. Prince Andrew and Prince Edward were 6 and 2 respectively, and Princess Anne a horse-mad 16-year-old. I could just imagine Princess Anne as a horse-mad 16-year-old. Well, actually, she's still horse-mad, isn't she? She's never changed. Well, so last episode we had sort of 1970 when he started as a footman. And then prior to that, we had it opening up with Prince Charles about to marry Lady Diana Spencer. So we're going back in time. This is when Stephen Barry even first applied to go to the palace, not necessarily to work as a valet, but when he first arrived at the palace. When I went for the interview, I wished I could have gone into the palace through the imposing iron gates on the Mall. But the staff entrance and the office where I'd been directed are on the side near the Royal Mews. The office itself is quite ordinary, but when I was taken along what is called the Master's Corridor, I was transported into a wonderful world. I was walking on the thickest carpet I'd ever seen. The walls were lined with pictures, gilt glinting from the frames, and the impression of amazing peace. And he said it was such a contrast from the traffic noise and everything out in the Mall to this really quiet, plush, beautiful corridor. The other little thing I will say is that he didn't tell his mum that he was applying for the job. And he actually wrote a letter to apply for the job, and he was so surprised when he heard back. His mum was really excited. People do get lost sometimes, but not as often as they do at Windsor Castle. And then he says this, at Windsor, people have been known to be lost for hours, particularly in the days when the royal family held state visits there. I was always finding some poor official or dignitary from a far-flung land wandering around totally lost and attempting to tell me in his best English where he thought he ought to be. It would be an awful feeling. Can you imagine if you're supposed to be at a certain time, certain place to meet the Queen, to be greeted by the Queen, and you get lost on your way from your bedroom to the reception room where you're supposed to go, and you're just wandering aimlessly and you're going through all these different doors and you keep getting to dead ends and all sorts of things. Oh, it would be just so, you'd have so much anxiety, wouldn't you? Now, the main criteria for whether he got the job or not was whether he was the right height, because all the footmen are actually matched with another person, with another footman. So if you match basically the height of someone who's already there, well, you'll get the job. But if you're too short or too tall, well, you won't get the job. So sure enough, they called in another footman to see how they squared off, and they got them to stand back to back, and luckily Stephen Barry was the right height. So he got the job. A couple of weeks elapsed and then I received the letter telling me the job was mine at £28 a month. So £28 a month for a footman. So I'm guessing then that it was £98. Remember in the last episode I said, oh, I wonder if that's per month or per year. What is it? I'm guessing that £98 per month was to be the manservant to the then Prince Charles. So that was his pay rise. Pretty significant. So in September 1966, clutching my luggage, I went to live in Buckingham Palace. Now, he goes on to say that he would often ride on the carriages for special occasions, and often when they would go to ambassadors' residences and stuff, they'd have to be in the full gear and everything. Carriages are great fun. We got ourselves dressed up in our scarlet tailcoats and off we went round to the mews where the carriages waited. We were not supposed to talk once we were standing in place on the footplate, but people in the streets would grin and wave at us while we looked straight ahead and pretended we didn't notice. We were young, so I'm afraid we often giggled. Isn't that gorgeous? After dropping the ambassador off at the palace, we'd hang around in the courtyard until it was time to take him back to his embassy, and we'd be given a glass of champagne or two. They always sent out a tray of drinks for the coachman and the footman. Happily, the horses knew their way home. Gee, they were looked after, weren't they? For the state openings of Parliament, where we wore full livery with a huge tricorn hat and a sword, it was a marvellous feeling to be helping in the ceremony. In the early days, I was usually on the back of Princess Anne's carriage or Princess Margaret's, looking straight ahead as they waved to the crowds. Being part of that tradition was the best thing about getting the job. I remember my first night at the palace. Before getting into bed, I stood staring down at the Mall and thinking, how exciting. I'm on the inside looking out. So then he was sort of assigned in little bits and pieces to be sort of helping out as a sort of manservant / footman to other equerries and things like that. I was assigned to Lord Plunket, a delightful man who was a great friend of the Queen and acted as her equerry. Sadly, he died in 1975. So he's gaining in confidence, he's getting little bits of experience, little snippets of experience. Being a footman at the palace is rather like being a messenger in an office or a page in a hotel. There's a lot of time spent sitting around waiting for something to do. I took boxes and letters around to different members of the household, but rarely got out. If a letter had to be delivered somewhere in London, the sergeant footman would use one of the outdoor messengers for the task. The Queen's footman, now Paul Burrell was one of the Queen's footmen. I do know that. And this was his sort of jobs. She has 2 of them, and they were exempt from sort of carrying messages or anything. Their basic job was to look after Her Majesty's corgis and do any running around that was necessary. So that's how Paul Burrell started at Buckingham Palace. Today, it would be more difficult for someone like me with no training to get a palace post. The staff now come mostly from college and catering schools, or they've been in hotel work and are already trained or qualified in hospitality. That's interesting, isn't it? And it's sad in a way because, someone that just basically finished their basic schooling like him could actually write a letter and get a job at the palace. But, past that point, you would have had to have gone on to some sort of tertiary education or some sort of technical college qualification. Almost immediately after I started work, I was transferred to helping in the royal nursery. That's what I was telling you about last episode. My job was to look after the nanny, the lovely Mabel Anderson. And we know Stephen Barry has a real soft spot for Mabel Anderson because she used to sit with him on the planes and stuff once he became the valet. And she used to tell him all naughty stories and inside goss and everything. And he just adored her. And the 2 little princes. I didn't have to do anything personal for the children as Mabel had a nursery maid for all the minor things, but I did help to keep Andrew amused. Now this is Andrew. This is Prince Andrew as a little brat. Tugging at the footman's tailcoats, climbing to reach anything that had been put out of his reach, he was a very strong personality. And he was even extremely good looking even then. Well, he was when he was younger. He was quite a heartthrob. He's going to be one of the best of the royals, Mabel Anderson always said. Well, she got that wrong. And she should know. She was nanny to all the Queen's children. It's a pity, really, isn't it? Years later, when Prince Charles saw his brother, Andrew, give Stephen Barry a friendly whack across the shoulders in the corridors of the palace one day, he said, "Andrew, don't hit Stephen." "But Charles," said Andrew, "I always hit Stephen." "It was true," said Stephen Barry. "He had." In those days, now this is interesting, this is a little bit of protocol. In those days, we called the children by their Christian names. The Queen liked to do this in an effort to keep them as natural as possible. I called them Andrew and Edward until they were 14 and before going to Gordonston School. After that, they became Prince Andrew and Prince Edward. But the situation changed when they reached 18. The Lord Chamberlain's office sent out a note saying, "Her Majesty the Queen wishes that Prince Andrew, on reaching his 18th birthday, should be addressed as His Royal Highness." I'm sure Randy Andy would have just loved that. Prince Andrew is someone that apparently, from what I've read, just adores the trappings of royalty. He likes all that. A little bit like Princess Margaret. She adored the trappings of royalty. She didn't let anyone get away with not curtsying or not addressing her correctly. She really loved all that. On Mabel Anderson's day off, the Queen would come in the evening and babysit with her 2 children. She'd arrive in the nursery, settle herself down in Mabel's chair to watch TV or to read, and wait quietly until Mabel came back. Her own page and footman would attend her, bringing her dinner, and if the children woke, she'd go and soothe them back to sleep. I bet she really looked forward to that. Prince Charles was in and out of the nursery all the time when he was home, always at meal times. He particularly liked to have a nursery breakfast there because he found it really cosy in the nursery and he really loved it. And I think really Mabel Anderson was like, a mother to him really. Because the Queen, she was so busy, she was just working all the time. So I guess he attached to who he could attach to. When Prince Andrew and Prince Edward were small, he liked to play with them and they adored him. He enjoyed the big brother role because the Duke was away so much. When they were tiny, they rarely saw their father. I didn't know that. I didn't know that Prince Andrew and Prince Edward really saw their father. When I got to know the prince well, I realised he likes anything that he calls cosy, and the nursery is nearer to being cosy than anywhere else in the palace. The fast turnover of staff means that the ambitious ones in royal service can get promoted quite quickly. So that's interesting, isn't it? If you just stick it out, you tend to get promoted. My chance came when the Queen went to Malta in 1967. My job on that trip was to attend the Queen's equerry, Major Howard. So he's making the most of his time there. He's keeping an eye on the prize, keeping an eye on possible promotions. He's a good worker, Stephen Barry, good networker, isn't he? I had become friendly with a chap named Joe Pearce, who was valet to the Duke of Edinburgh. And in 1968, after 2 years' experience, I was chosen to go with the Duke on a 6-week trip to Australia. James Orr, his private secretary, was who Stephen Barry looked after. Now, this is interesting. This is about Prince Philip. I've always been a bit afraid of the Duke. Don't blame you. I would be terrified of the Duke. It was quite abrupt. I don't do well. Let me know down below if you do well with people with that sort of personality that are really abrupt and everything. I'm not. I crumble. I fall to pieces. But in fact, he turned out to be very nice. Well, there you go. He turned out to be very nice. He seemed to like me, and it couldn't have been pleasanter. We had a stopover at Jeddah, and we were sitting around the airport drinking thick, sweet Turkish coffee. I began to feel rather poorly, and by the time we got back onto the plane, I was very poorly indeed, and disappeared to be ill for the first and I hope the only time on the aircraft. The Duke gave me a sharp look as I reappeared, no doubt pale green. "All right," he said in a sort of brisk way. I nodded shakily. "You'll learn from experience not to drink that muck," he said. On the way back, he gave us a thank you meal in Pakistan, and there I was, 20 years old and dining with the Duke of Edinburgh. Can you imagine? Wouldn't that be absolutely amazing? All right, I'm going to give you chapter 4 just because I'm super generous. That was quite long, but I think this is quite a little shorty, so I will do it. The Prince and I were both a little shy with each other when I started working for him. He'd never had a valet before, and I'd never been one. This is titled, chapter 4, by the way, Royal Plumage. One of the wardrobe rooms is set aside for ceremonial clothing. Now, he goes on to list all the sort of uniforms that the then Prince Charles has, and there was a lot. To roughly list them, there are 3 different Navy uniforms, 2 RAF ones. He is also colonel of 6 different regiments, all of which that have 3 uniforms each, mess dress, khaki, and number 1s. There is also a selection of tropical whites, his Gordon Highlanders kilt, and all sorts of other paraphernalia. He has 3 sets of robes for the Order of the Garter for England, the Order of the Thistle for Scotland, and the Order of the Bath. The Prince is a great master of the Order of the Bath. Then there's parliamentary robes and several boxes of robes connected with universities and different degrees. I had to learn about these and what decorations went with them. Oh my gosh, that would be hard, and you wouldn't want to get it wrong, would you? He said to me one morning, not long before he married, "I took the key to the wardrobe room last night, so don't worry if you find the doors open. I just wanted to show Lady Diana the amount of uniforms I have." I was given a weekly sheet of all his engagements, and it would immediately be obvious if there was a uniform or robe required to be worn. From it, I would prepare the clothing we would need. If he had to wear a uniform, I always got it out well in advance to make the right decorations and so on. And he would also have to make sure that the buttons were in place and that nothing was going to fall off and any minor repairs would be done. He did pack for himself once a year, and that was for his skiing holiday at Cloisters. When I emptied his suitcases, I had no fear of him taking over my job. When we were on royal tour, I kept a checklist of what clothing we had. And what he used to do is he would have numbered bags, and then he would have a list of what was in every bag. And often they wouldn't unpack if they were on tour. They would just sort of hang the hanging bags up in the wardrobe, but keep everything inside them. And then if the prince asked for anything in particular, he would know, okay, the brown cords are in that bag. He would know exactly where everything was. Laundry and dry cleaning were kept up to date en route, but I dealt with the handkerchiefs myself. And I think I said that in another video at Royal Secrets, because people used to pinch them because it had the then Prince of Wales crest on the hanky, and people used to take them for souvenirs. So Stephen Barry got sick of that, so he hand washed his hankies. Ew. I don't think I'd want to hand wash anyone's hanky. Then he goes on to say about ordering new shirts from Turnbull and Asser and new suits. And he says a really funny thing, because there was a Mr. Watson from Halls and Curtis of Dover Street, and he would ring for appointments for fittings, and then he would turn up in a large Rolls Royce. And then Prince Charles used to look out the window and then say to Stephen Barry, because he couldn't see, what did Watson turn up in today? And he'd say, "The Rolls, sir." Now, when it came time to propose to Lady Diana Spencer, Stephen Barry points out that Prince Charles had never been in a jewellery shop, so they got a tray sent in. Prince Charles had never been in a jewellery shop in his life. He did not even shop for the engagement ring for Princess Diana. A selection was sent to Windsor Castle for her to choose from. And of course we know that because Diana actually said on the record, didn't she, that she just chose the biggest one. I have had the fun of dressing up in most of the prince's regalia at different times because, like Prince Philip's man, if there was a portrait to be painted, then they would get the manservant to actually put on all the regalia and sit there for the boring part, and then they would just come in for the hands and the head. So, yeah, they wouldn't have to be bored to death sort of sitting for an artist. And that is the end of chapter 4. So we're up to chapter 5, next episode, Bed and Breakfast. And I have no idea what that's about because I haven't read it yet. I've only read 4 chapters, so I'm now up to date with you. So thank you so much for joining me for Royal Service, our 2nd episode, and I'll be back next week with another one. Thanks for joining me. Bye.